Welcome to Dave and Dharm Demystify, a FinTech Futures podcast, helping make sense of the world of FinTech and digital finance. Please sit back and listen as the two Ds take a subject and discuss it to make it clearer and easier to understand.
Demystify.
Welcome everybody to the Dave and Dharm Demystify show, and this week we're going to demystify DORA. And for those that don't know, it's not a little girl carrying a backpack. I have two experts, Simon and Alex, who are going to help me and Dave to demystify what DORA actually is. But to start with, Simon, do you want to give yourself a bit of an intro and then hand over to Alex to do the same?
Yeah, no, of course. Thanks, Dharmesh. Simon Phillips, CTO at SecureAck, and before being at SecureAck, have over a decade of IT and cybersecurity experience, working in defensive and offensive roles in some large and medium-sized organizations.
Fantastic. Alex?
Yeah, so I run a consultancy called Cloudify.io, where we help businesses with their cloud infrastructures and platforms. I've primarily worked in the fintech space, and over the last few years specialized in cost optimization. I've also been looking at DORA and its importance for fintechs over the last year or so. So yeah, that is of special interest to me as well.
Fantastic. So should we start with this burning question? What actually is DORA?
Let's do a DORA Explorer, shall we?
At a really high level, I mean, we're talking about a dynamic and flexible regulation in relation to digital resilience, making sure systems are up and running, along with how they might be impacted by cybersecurity and third-party risk, I think at a very high level.
I think that covers it. The target of these regulations is specifically fintechs, right? So banks, investment, anything that's related to that.
And where are we at with the Act itself? Just for those that didn't quite catch it, the DORA stands for Digital Operational Resiliency Act. So where are we at with this at the moment? I mean, is it in play? What's the status of it?
So presumably the deadline is the start of next year. So start of 2025. I believe it's the end of January. So we're getting there.
What does it mean? I mean, as a deadline, what do fintechs and banks have to have in place by the end of January?
That's probably the difficult part. I think ultimately, because it's so dynamic and flexible, I think that's quite open for interpretation. I mean, ultimately, they're meant to have covered off the vast majority of what's in the regulation, have processes in place to be able to do that and be ready to carry out and enact what's inside the regulation, as well as having that ready to report upwards to the regulatory authorities.
One interesting thing that I've found in the language of the document itself is that they use the word reasonable. So they talk about putting reasonable controls in place. So of course, that's open to interpretation, and that's a part of the challenge.
So can I ask, I'm going to ask a really dumb question, because I get it's about resiliency, but what does that actually mean? If I'm a bank or a fintech, what do I have to put in place in order to reasonably comply with the regulation? And, what sort of scenarios is it dealing with? And I mean that in terms of, you talk about cybersecurity. So is this people trying to take services down, or what is it that we're dealing with?
Yeah, so this refers to cybersecurity, as you mentioned, but it also refers to resilience in the more general term of, let's say, uptime. So specifically for banks, part of the regulation is that they cannot have unexpected downtime. Like if you have too much downtime in a given amount of time, you'll have to pay penalties and fees and that sort of thing. The regulation talks about this as well. So it's not just the security angle in the sense of an attack or a hacker or a data breach or something like that. It's also just keeping the system running and keeping the system up at all times.
And is this to protect people's access to money, essentially? This is an effort by the government to ensure regulation is in place that means people, if there's an outage, like there's been some classic outages, I guess TSB is the one which sort of sticks in my head, where people just couldn't access their money. It's to prevent that sort of thing from happening as well.
Absolutely. And there are already, these sorts of regulations are already in place and have been in place. So banks do have this requirement that they need to provide a stable service. That's not a new thing necessarily. And this new document, DORA, does not live on its own, I guess. It lives within an ecosystem of other similar requirements such as ISO certification or, this sort of thing.
I guess one of the big changes really is about the visibility and reporting. You have to report up incidents. You have to report up your entire asset inventory that's related to these critical systems. So I guess it's giving the regulator much more insights into how all of these organizations are actually individually operating, and also what shared services might exist between them, and therefore be able to work out what the risks are to the financial institutions as a whole.
I mean, when I think about it, when I started in the banks 2 years ago, when we put systems out, we had disaster recovery plans. There was no cloud as such, right? It was all on-prem, and we had duplicate data centers to switch over if there was an outage. So banks really, I think, have been used to having kind of disaster recovery plans. What's different now with DORA? Obviously, the cloud is an aspect of it. But what's different now? Why do we need DORA now? Because obviously we had some plans in the past.
I think DR is a part of resiliency. If I'm honest, it's probably the end part of resiliency. I think before you get to DR, you have all the other independent services that make up the service that you're building. Those little building blocks should all have their own resiliency built in. And then you absolutely still have that last resort. What do you do when it's all completely gone? Maybe you're pulling the tapes out of somewhere and rebuilding the entire infrastructure like we used to. I'm sure that still exists at the very far end of the scale, but there's that scale in place. The other thing that's interesting is how it pulls in the IT service providers. And, in particular, what we might say is critical IT service providers, which again would be open for interpretation. But I think that's something that's particularly interesting about this regulation, because it's not just you as an entity, it's you and everything else that makes up your service that you provide.
So I mean, that could be an AWS or an IBM or your cloud company. You've got to make sure that they comply with the regulation as well. Is that right?
Yes, and there's a couple of interesting things related to this. The first thing is that cloud providers often talk about a thing that they call the shared responsibility model, where they essentially clarify which things fall under the user's responsibility, the user being the person who uses the cloud, or rather the business that uses the cloud, and which sets of responsibilities sit with them. So AWS will say, as an example, they have the data centers. They are responsible for physical access to those data centers. As a user of their cloud services, you don't have to worry about that bit, right? However, if you run an application on their cloud services, you do have to worry about, let's say, how your application stores passwords or does authentication or something like that. So yeah, shared responsibility model is an important one. The other thing this makes me think about is a few years ago, with a lot of the new banks starting up in the UK, banks like Monzo, Revolut, Starling, these sorts of new wave banks, as well as older banks looking to transition into the cloud, one of the emerging problems was that everybody was sort of going for AWS as the de facto leader in the cloud space. And that causes a bit of a national level risk, I guess, where essentially all of the UK banks, or a large percentage or large proportion of UK banks, have all of their data in their systems on AWS. So that's a single point of failure. It's also an American bank having all of this in their hands. So in theory, if they were a malicious actor, they could just turn off all of the UK banks in one fell swoop.
So, I mean, if I was a small bank, obviously, this is a complex scenario, right? Would I not think, well, actually, if I just stick my core banking system into Google, then it's Google's responsibility to make sure that there's some disaster recovery in the case that some of their servers running my software goes out. Is that not the case, or?
I mean, I think it's part of the case. I mean, they're responsible. I think going back to shared responsibility piece, they're responsible for certain components because they'll be classed as critical IT service providers. But you still need to have third-party risk management in place, making sure that vendors are doing as they say they are, that they are compliant. But ultimately, they will have essentially direct regulatory oversight is, I guess, the other major change. If you're classed as critical, the regulator is allowed to request unrestricted access to any data they require, which, again, is particularly challenging in these shared cloud environments. And whether or not we can get the organizations to give up that data is challenging. I think that's probably the slight difference. And then as an organization, you put your applications on top of that. The applications require that resiliency as well. So it's not just as simple as having server resiliency. You need to have the applications supporting that level of resiliency too.
And critically, your cloud provider is never going to be responsible for the application that you're deploying on it.
Yeah, I kind of see that makes sense because, it's the bank's responsibility to make sure that there is a banking service available. Even if a branch blow up, they'd have to work out some way of, ensuring people could still get their money. But it also kind of highlights a complexity issue here. One, which is like, firstly, having done kind of Y2K in one of the tier one banks, they didn't have really a clue about how many systems that they had. I'm not being harsh. There was no single registry of all of their systems. You had to go to each business line department and also IT to kind of correlate as to what systems we actually had in place, right? So that's the first thing is like, do banks really have a strong software and systems asset registry? And the second thing is that even if you take, some of these cloud providers, let's say you take a third party, core banking system, nobody writes the entire core banking system or should do anymore, right? And so they all part of almost like a marketplace where, their solution calls another solution, which calls another solution. Is all happening through HTTPS across the cloud. So even if you did a DR and said, switch off the core, and it had all these other dependencies on it, that just resolve themselves, because it's going through the web. How do you test? I mean, like I see the two issues. So let's start with the asset registry. I mean, what's your experience of banks and their knowledge of what assets they got? Are they using tools to kind of gather this information and manage it effectively?
To some extent, yes, they do have an idea of what they're running. Usually with cloud providers, at the end of the month, you get a bill, an itemized bill of everything you've paid for. You sort of by default do have a listing or registry of everything that you've paid for. There are, of course, things on the cloud that you can also run without paying for them, that you could get them for free. At the same time, especially as someone who has worked on cost optimization projects for multiple of these entities, I can say that there are definitely a lot of bits of infrastructure lying around where people are not sure what they're for. And a lot of times, the way to figure that out is to sort of go, okay, what happens when we turn this off? What breaks? And then make your way back to the source and just identify what the system is doing. So, yeah.
And I wonder, how deep the asset registers go. I think in my experience, most of them, if you have anything, they're probably not complete, but they stop at like the machine level quite often. I mean, for this to really work, you need to know the application, you need to know the components that make up the application, because we could have a shared open source library that sits underneath this. I mean, is that critical? And is that part of the IT supply chain? Where does that fall into the risks and how we are, making sure that they're resilient, how that code's being tested? So I guess even if there is one, it's probably not deep enough to cover everything that's required.
Yeah, I suspect that this is very similar to open source, where you might call a library, but you don't know what libraries that's calling as well. And, very few people in the past have kind of gone down the rabbit hole to expose the full chain of libraries being used, and what's behind them is even more important, right? That's really why we want to get down the rabbit hole. But are there tools or things that banks can use to kind of make this task easier?
Yeah, there definitely are. So I'd say one of the industry leading bits of software in that regard, it's a fairly new company, is Sneak. And essentially what they do is they specialize in scanning your software for vulnerabilities, especially with the modern containerized systems and things like Kubernetes and Docker, open source projects. As you say, you don't know what that open source project is built on. You go down a rabbit hole. Depending on how many jumps you make, you eventually might get to the end of it. but also the end might be a bit meaningless. And I remember at some point last year, there was this one library used in the Node.js programming language, and NPM is the package manager for this. This was a bit of software that was downloaded by millions and millions of developers every day. And ultimately, all of these relied on this one tiny library that did a very simple thing, something like it was equivalent to a simple if statement. It was like the simplest thing, but it was something that somebody had written 10 years ago, never looked at again. And then on top of that, you had built millions of other abstractions.
In terms of DORA's reach, like, does it, I guess we've got examples of things like embedded banking and buy now, pay later. Does it extend into the sort of broader ecosystem? Does it kind of cover all fintech and banking, or is it quite specific to, I guess, core systems?
No, it's quite broad, is my understanding. And it covers essentially any institution that deals with sort of financial data. That's what I would say.
When we saw the last issue, was it CrowdStrike and Microsoft, right? That affected hospitals, utility companies, people weren't getting heat or light, etc. Why is this just financial services?
An interesting question there, though. Before I jump into that, I think, does that incident actually come into DORA? I think, are they classified as critical IT service providers? Because I think that depends on how you build up the asset register we were just talking about. It's a piece of software that sits on the machine. Are they just an IT service provider, or are they critical? If they're critical, then there's absolutely, some DORA reach into them. If they're not critical, they're listed, they might get determined as critical later. They probably are now. But I wonder if at the time they would have been classified as critical, and how many other components like that would fall into a similar bag that might get missed until there's an incident.
I mean, the mass disruption that was caused by that outage seems to imply that we probably underestimated what systems are critical. It was aviation, it was trains, it was hospitals, it was all sorts, right?
Probably banking as well, but one of the things I've been hearing about is banks starting to think about kind of digital twins and building up sort of replicas of Dharmesh talked about disaster recovery, but this is more thinking about kind of cloud-based applications. Is that happening, do you think? Or
yeah, it's definitely happening. I think maybe an interesting thing to cover is the mechanics that the cloud offers you for this sort of. Typically, cloud providers extend across various regions. For instance, on AWS, you might deploy your stuff in their Ireland region or their Frankfurt region or their London region if you're in Europe. Beyond that, they also offer what they call availability zones, which ultimately translate to data centers, right? So you may have availability zone A, B, and C, and what these really are different data centers within that same region. The idea sort of being that if there was a destructive event at one of the data centers, let's say caught on fire, then you would still have your infrastructure deployed on other availability zones as well, or in other data centers, so you wouldn't be affected by that disaster.
Interesting.
Just so that, we started with this deadline of January, the end of January 25, right, which is like a couple of months away. But it sounds like because of the interpretation of the regulation, the banks can do probably the minimum that they think they can get away with. And actually, there's a lot more work to be done. What's your experience out in the field from how far have banks got? How much work have they got left to do?
I think there's still a lot to be done. And because, as Simon mentioned, one of the things that DORA talks about a lot is the reporting requirements and information sharing, and about building up a sort of knowledge base of potential threats. One of the things that DORA requests is that banks should, as an example, report incidents, but also report things that they consider potential threats, right? So not just if something went wrong, but also maybe something could go wrong in the future if we don't do something about this, or here's something interesting to investigate. It talks about building up this knowledge base. And I think when you get into this sort of collaborative effort within the industry, that's not something that you can just build overnight. It's something that will require a lot of changes within in how these businesses work together.
So I guess, is there a kind of DORA checklist out there where I'm assuming everybody who needs to be complying with the regulation has started down this, but maybe there's a few companies out there who this is kind of news to them. Is there a sort of list of things that you absolutely need to do?
Yeah, like an action plan, right?
Yeah, an action plan.
Yeah, I think there's several action plans out there. I think the challenge always comes down to the fact that they are quite high level. So they will talk again about a simplified version of the regulation and the things that you should be looking at. I would be skeptical of any action plan that was very specific that said you should deploy this, because the whole purpose of the regulation to be flexible is that it meets the organizational needs. And if we go back to sort of business impact assessment, I mean, that's ultimately what we should be doing. We should be taking the service, doing an impact assessment on the service, probably focusing initially on things that are most visible to the customer base, because if they go down, they're obviously going to get regulatory oversight fairly quickly because it's caused chaos. It will hit the news, the media, and then focus backwards from there, looking at how those services work and operate. So I think it's very difficult to write a rule book or a playbook of how to do that, apart from guiding you through, you should have resiliency, you need to define what this looks like. The documentation, though, and how that should work is fairly well documented in many of the action plans out there, because we need to justify all of the decisions that we make. Because it's flexible, there is, in theory, no right or wrong answer. There's just decisions behind it. So you have to document all of those very carefully so that if there is an issue, you can go back and explain why you are in the position you're in, what led you to that, what lessons you've learned, and how you'll then rectify that in the future. Because it's not just we hit the January and it's done. We have to continuously improve. That's a very big part of the regulation as well.
I probably mistakenly have only thought about this as, an outage that was a mistake or something like that. But does it also cover things like cyber attacks? Somebody purposely trying to hack the bank. Does it also cover that?
Yeah, it definitely does. And if you don't mind, before we move to that, something I was just thinking about is because DORA also extends to the entire supply chain, and this relates to what we talked about, the open source, sort of like how deep does the rabbit hole go. But also at a business level, you have a supply chain, you may have subcontractors and things like that. So DORA does apply to those as well. So you do have to identify, let's say, critical subcontractors, or those that are dealing with things that are critical. And then they have to comply with those regulations as well.
Cool. And so, go back to the cyber thing then.
Yeah. So with regards to the cyber thing, the DORA regulation does also talk about doing things like penetration testing or employing the services of reputable or recognized security teams, using good, strong security tools that automatically test your infrastructure, test your systems, run simulated attacks, things like that, red team efforts to break into your system, that sort of thing. It does cover all of these as well.
So the interesting thing on the pen testing is they talk about it being threat-led pen testing, especially for the core systems. They also talk about how that needs to include your third parties that are in scope. So that includes those IT service providers that we were talking about earlier, making sure that they're involved in that threat-led pen testing, which again causes potentially contractual issues depending on what these contracts look like, to get on board those suppliers to actually be engaged and working with you during those sort of scenario-based testing that needs to be undertaken.
Well, listen, we're sort of starting to run out of time. It sounds like there's a long way to play on DORA. It doesn't sound like the 25th of January is the end of the discussion. It sounds more like the start of the discussion. One of the things that I'm kind of interested in is the vagueness of the regulation itself. I mean, Alex, you said it, the word reasonable always leaves lots of interpretation. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how quickly this then gets tested in a case, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And when I think back to this year and think, for example, the CrowdStrike and Microsoft events, these are industry giants, we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about CrowdStrike, very well recognized businesses. Anybody would tell you, oh yeah, I'm using Windows and I'm using CrowdStrike. You'd think, okay, you should be covered. But the reality of the situation is you're not. So as always, it's the unknowns that are the problem, right? It's not the threats and the vulnerabilities that we know of that are problematic. It's the things that blindside you.
Before we wrap up, is there any final advice that both of you would give to banks and fintechs? Any key tips that would help them along the way?
I think I'd go back to focusing on business impact, going back, making sure that you've covered off all of those critical areas, checking what the customer is likely to be impacted with first, and then working inwards and just double checking that includes enough depth into the third-party suppliers and that you've identified which of those might be critical, and perhaps taking into account some of the events of the year past with CrowdStrike and making sure that if you do have software that's deployed across all of the systems, perhaps they should be considered as critical.
My advice would be, and this is something I've seen over the years many times happen, implement processes, make sure they're good, they're strong, that they check for the things that they need to be checking, but don't make your processes so restrictive that it encourages your employees to try to work around them. Something that I've seen happen again and again, and it's very destructive, is businesses make it so difficult to deploy anything, to do any useful work because of the red tape and all of these safeguards, that people just try to work around them, try to ignore them and do things differently. And that is worse than not having the right controls in place.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That's a real run through the whole DORA topics. Thank you.
I think we could have another few hours and still wouldn't be enough time to cover everything that needs to be covered here.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's a hot topic, and I think we've done a pretty good job of demystifying it. So thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.
Cheers.
Thank you for tuning in to Dave and Dharm Demystify. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next time as we take another topic and demystify it.